Okay, thank you so much. There's so many technological things going on. We have Zoom, we have screen sharing. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to so many of you who have done so much to support me over, I guess, almost 7 years of researching and writing this book. And thank you so much to the Northeast Harbor Library for hosting this event. Many pages of it were written within these walls. So it's really a privilege to be here giving a talk on the book. And I also want to thank my family who's here in great numbers, the audience, and my children. The end of the acknowledgements, it's dedicated to them. It reads, finally to Bobby, Weston, Sebastian, Alice, and Louise, and to the rest of my family for keeping me tethered during every stage of this process. The initial draft of this book was written in my daughter's first 3 weeks of life. Named after Barbara Cooney's Miss Rumphius, she is asked, what will you do, little Alice, to make the world more beautiful? If small glimmers of hope for human action may be gleaned from these pages, this will be her first contribution. This book is dedicated to my children. So this book studies elections after civil wars and answers the question, why do so many voters support parties that engaged in mass violence against civilians during wartime? And then what are the implications of these elections of bloodstained parties for peace, democracy, justice, and governance? The project answers that bloodstained parties, if war winning, successfully campaign as the best providers of future societal peace. The seed for this book was planted in an undergraduate course at Stanford, a politics of human rights course, in which we learned about the coup in Chile and about the 40,000 victims that the Pinochet dictatorship left in its wake. And I assumed, given these human rights abuses of the Pinochet regime, that all Chileans naturally would reject Pinochet. And then I went to study in Chile, and I lived with a family that was very much pro-Pinochet, joining the ranks of 44% of the population that was pro-Pinochet even after the transition to democracy. I was struck by this. I was struck again while I was researching my first book, which asked, why do half of peace agreements fail while half succeed? For this book, I spent 18 months in Colombia interviewing rebels and paramilitaries and their victims. And these fighters and their victims told me about the indiscriminate massacres and homicides, rapes, torture, kidnappings that the armed groups carried out. And yet I found that in many places, the population supported these former fighters and their allied politicians, even after they had surrendered their weapons and demobilized. I found that these patterns exhibit themselves broadly. Around the world, after winning peace, voters support parties with deep roots in the violent organizations of the past. They do so in the aftermath of nearly every civil war, short wars, long wars, in ethnic societies, non-ethnic societies, where they're peacekeepers, where they're not peacekeepers, in rich countries, poor countries. For example, in 1999, the party of General Rios Montt, accused of genocide, won. In El Salvador, the party most closely tied to the death squads, responsible with the armed forces for the vast majority of political killings, won. In Colombia in 2018, the party of President Álvaro Uribe, facing hundreds of investigations for ties to the paramilitaries and what Human Rights Watch called one of the worst episodes of mass atrocity in the Western Hemisphere, won. So figuring out why is what inspired me to write this book. I began research for the book expecting that how violent the parties were would influence the party's electoral success. But I found across all cases of civil war globally since 1970 that indiscriminately violent rebels and militaries did just as well in the elections as parties that exercised restraint in their use of violence. Of course, it could be that national level patterns are masking regional ones, and that at a regional level, violent parties victimized regions were voting against the violent parties, whereas non-victimized ones voted for the victimizers. But across 18 cases for which detailed Information is available on atrocities and voting. There's no consistent relationship between how much violence the belligerents carried out and their later electoral success at a local level. Terrorized regions voted for these violent parties in proportions similar to regions unscathed by their wartime campaigns of violence. Here, this just shows the atrocities at the municipal level in Guatemala tracked against the FRG, this party derived from the armed forces, their vote share. And you see that whether or not the government was responsible for minimal or excessive uses of violence at the municipal level, the vote share was constant. And indeed, it was the Mayan region of the Western Highlands against which General Rios Montt ordered a genocide that voted for the FRG after the peace accords. But it could be that victims are voting differently than non-victims, that victims are voting against their perpetrators of violence, whereas non-victims are voting for them. In El Salvador, the Truth Commission revealed that the state security forces and the death squads were responsible for 95% of the atrocities, and the rebels for 5%. And yet, according to survey data, victims voted for Arena, the party derived from the death squads, in large numbers. And I show that similar patterns hold across many contexts. Victims themselves proved equally likely to vote for perpetrators as for parties unstained by war. So I thought, well, maybe all of these votes are forced, that people are voting with a gun to their head, that they're casting their ballots out of fear of violent retribution or fear that were the party to lose the election, it would return to war. But these parties are also winning elections that were deemed free and fair. They're winning the votes not only of those very vulnerable, casting their ballots out of fear, but also those who were voting freely. They win over time, even as the risk of war recurrence and the memory of coercion fade. And they receive not only the votes of, but also the attitudinal, the real support of voters. This graph merely shows that there's no relationship between electoral coercion and violent parties' vote shares. So then I thought maybe this is a fog of war story. Maybe people were ignorant about the atrocities or didn't know whom the perpetrators were. But many of these elections came after truth commissions had reported, so the populations knew the facts of the violence. I find that it's also not the case that the victims were all displaced, leaving only non-victims to vote, nor is it the case that victims were just proportionately abstaining, leaving only victims to vote. It's also not the case that citizens were voting for co-ethnics irrespective of their atrocities, but in non-ethnic societies, victims were punishing their perpetrators. So what is going on? In short, I find that peace and security can explain why people vote for bloodstained parties. So I'm going to tell you this violent victors argument, tell you a little bit about how I evaluate the argument in the book, tell you a story of one of the cases of Guatemala, and then tell you a little bit about some of the ideas and areas I think that this book might motivate additional work on. Very academic. So I find that it doesn't matter how much violence the parties carried out, but what matters is the military outcomes of the war. If war winning, bloodstained parties can successfully campaign as the best providers of future societal peace and stability, counterintuitively selling themselves as protectors of voters. Violent parties are able to claim credit for peace. This credit for peace serves to justify their use of atrocities. They convince the population to compare their use of violence in war, not to a world in which they used no violence, but to a world in which the violence continued. And relative to this very bleak prospect, the population rewards the violent parties with their votes for the relief that comes with peace. This cleanses their military record, which then translates into a reputation for competence on providing security. But voters have very real concerns that these parties may re-victimize again in the future. So to perform well in the elections, these parties have to signal to voters that they fulfill both of James Madison's requisites of government. Not only the strength to control the governed, which they clearly have given their military victory, but also the restraint to control themselves. Signals of restraint include purging rights abusers from their party or burying them in closed legislative lists, while keeping their strong leader in charge in order to signal the party's security credentials. And moderating positionally, this is what I call the restrained Leviathan electoral strategy. Desperate for peace, voters elect these bloodstained parties to protect them. So in some, if in the US, people say elections are about the economy, stupid. In context emerging from the anarchy of civil war, it's security, stupid. The book has implications for peace, justice, democracy, and governance. The book finds that against frequently cited fears, post-conflict elections are not necessarily destabilizing, leading to a recurrence of war. Instead, the strong military position of the winners of the Civil War reduce incentives for their rivals to remilitarize, so peace tends to consolidate. But in electing peace and security, voters forego or at least postpone legal accountability for past atrocities and tend to suffer degradation in their democracies and social welfare. Electing a group that committed heinous crimes against humanity is not good for justice. The bloodstained parties tend to lock in their amnesties. But over time, as the power of these parties erodes, justice sometimes becomes more possible. The election of bloodstained parties tends to preserve democratic electoral rules. These parties keep in place the system that brought them to political power. But their elections are bad for liberalism. The parties tend to cause democratic backsliding. And finally, while the citizenry is likely to gain in the near term in the domain in which the violent parties have a comparative advantage and competence, and this is the security domain, they tend to lose on the welfare front as the parties prioritize law and order over other types of social and development expenditures. So because this is more of an academic book, I evaluate my argument, and I do so combining extensive field work and experimental data, party level archival evidence, and data on all parties around the world. I use cross-national evidence from new data I collected on all 205 belligerent parties around the world that transitioned from peace, from war to peace between 1970 and 2015, and then data at a local level on atrocities, war outcomes, and post-war election results for 18 countries globally. To reveal how parties strategize and their strategies, I engaged in a comparative study of El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Colombia, relying on archival research and over 350 interviews of victims and victimizers, politicians and party strategists, over 2 years of field work in these places. I analyzed the parties' platforms, their propaganda, their electoral targets, their candidate lists, both with natural language processing and hand coding. And then I used an original survey that I conducted in Colombia of victims and non-victims with what are called survey experiments and survey data on security voters across 16 countries, finding that on average, 54% of voters around the world after wars were most concerned with securing their future, and that these security voters were significantly more likely to vote for parties derived from the winning combatants over either militarily losing or nonviolent parties. I also look at what this means for governance and democracy and justice and peace. I collected data on 784 paramilitary mayors and how they ruled, derived from 42,000 pages of sentencing documents in Colombia and what's called a regression discontinuity design. And then I look at the effects on liberal democracy and amnesties, and look at original coding of whether or not the groups remilitarized, returned to violence, or demilitarized after the elections. So I'm not going to talk to you about all of this today, just a little bit shown in red. So before I turn to Guatemala, I just want to show that the overall argument holds globally. Because if the argument is correct, we should expect war outcomes to be a powerful predictor of post-war elections, and that we should expect this relationship between how the war ends and how the elections unfold to hold irrespective of the level of atrocities carried out in the war, and even where the elections are free, fair, and clean. These implications should also hold at a local level. We should see the violent parties winning even regions that they terrorized, and performing well, particularly where they win at a local level. So I created this data set of all belligerents since 1970, which this is the first data set that studies post-war election outcomes of rebel groups, government groups, and also non-violent parties. On average, non-violent parties won 43% of the vote, suggesting that parties with these violent paths tended to outperform the non-violent parties. So these figures show that war outcomes are powerful predictors of electoral performance, rebels and government belligerent parties. If militarily winning, abusive belligerent parties perform well even where the elections are clean, free, and fair. And for 18 cases, I can show that the level of atrocity doesn't explain the election outcomes, but that the vote share tracks with whether the violent groups militarily won or lost the war locally. So returning to the argument characterizes parties as winning violent parties, losing violent parties, or non-violent parties. And that this characterization can help explain how the parties run, how they devise their platforms, whom they target, whether they target core voters or swing voters, how they decide their candidates, what type of candidates they run, and how they deal with the violent past, whether they seek to punish it or mitigate it or apologize for it. So I look at this in the context of Central America, where you have government victory in Guatemala, rebel victory in Nicaragua, and a draw, stalemate in El Salvador. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of Guatemala, where the war ended in a military victory. This 36-year war was brutal. The military under FRG's leader, Rios Montt, carried out the Mayan Holocaust, which was characterized as genocide under international law. The Truth Commission revealed that the government side committed 90% of the atrocities. In 1999, founding free and fair elections were held, which pitted the FRG party, derived from Rios Montt's militarily winning brutal government, against a strong party without any blood on its hands, PAN, in the middle. PAN was formed by technocrats and business people and had no involvement in the military dictatorships. And then the losing, far less violent rebel party, the URNG, also tried its hands at the polls. And I'm going to tell you the story of how the nonviolent party and the far less violent party lost the election. To understand this, I draw in-depth interviews and various archives, including an incredible ephemera collection at Princeton of 11,000 ephemera and over 2,000 declassified primary source documents held in the National Security Archive. So to set the stage, coming out of war, Guatemala's electorate, as the argument assumes, were victimized, cared about security, and included many swing voters, unaligned co-optable voters. Approximately 1/5 of the Guatemalan population were victims, direct victims. So when you add their families and communities, a large part of the population were conflict affected. The end of Guatemala's long war brought relief and a moment of jubilation. In a national poll, 77% of Guatemalans said they felt happy. At the same time, over a third felt that security issues were the most important issues facing the country, a proportion equal to all economic issues, economic crisis, poverty, unemployment, education combined. And insecurity especially concerned unaligned voters, not affiliated with a party, which were 89% of the population. So to perform well in the elections, the parties, these belligerent parties that had relied on their very core hardcore supporters during the war, had to reach beyond these core supporters to capture the votes of these victimized and security and swing voters. So to do so, the book argues that nonviolent parties will use a strategy that I call a rule-abider strategy. It will offer security within the confines of the law because it can point to this clean record during the war. PUN conformed to this. It ran as the party that respected the law. It pinned its security competence on its lack of past transgressions, and it tried to undermine FRG's competence on security by arguing that it would only lead to more impunity and more abuses of human rights. And to make this legalistic claim, it ran civilians, as you can see, in suits. It targeted moderate voters. It offered its general competence, PUN responde, PUN will respond, PUN gets things done. And it emphasized that it would punish the FRG for its mass atrocities during the war. In response to this strong plea by PUN for voters to choose an unstained party, FRG, as predicted by the argument, ran as what I call a restrained Leviathan. FRG argued that Rios Montt had delivered a decisive solution to the conflict, which brought peace to the country. It argued that for not doubling down on the military's violence, but instead ending the violence, it should be rewarded. Rios Montt famously said that the record of pacification will judge what has been done in the past, meaning the atrocities. FRG perceived its competence on security to lie with its ties to the armed forces, but also the symbolic edge that was embodied in its strongman. Rios Montt ran as the old-fashioned caudillo, the man on horseback who comes to save the nation. He was always running in army fatigues to signal the party's strength. It then would prime the security issue, arguing that Guatemala was emerging from anarchy that justified submission to a strong man, as in Hobbes's terms, a sovereign. But the opposition's as warned voters, FRG has bullets planned for the future. And so FRG also had to signal restraint. One way in which it did so is it paired Rios Montt's candidacy with leftist Portillo, who was a victim of the conflict, who could signal that the FRG wouldn't victimize in the future. FRG also took costly steps. It purged its human rights abusers from its elite, and it stacked its legislative ticket with mostly civilian candidates who could, including its former enemies and victims, that could signal that it wouldn't re-victimize. The book argues that war losers, even if they are less violent, they can't justify their violent past with credit for peace. And so they emerge from war without any credibility on the provision of security. Vanquished in war, the URNG rebels adopted what I call a tactical and moderate strategy. It emphasized non-security issues, the stomach, poverty, inequality, social, economic issues. It demonstrated contrition for its past atrocities rather than trying to spin the atrocities or try to punish the atrocities. It positioned itself in moderately, saying reform, 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 and it targeted adjacent ideological voters, the poor, for the poor, of the poor. And in so doing, it sought to just gain a piece at the table of post-war politics, even if it were a limited one, and to set itself up to compete in future elections. So voters faced this clean rule abider, nonviolent party, this cleaner, tactical and moderate rebel party, and this brutal, restrained Leviathan government party. And in line with the argument, voters counterintuitively credited the brutal one for peace, blamed the less brutal one for the wartime violence, and saw the nonviolent party neutrally. And with this cleansed record and this restrained Leviathan strategy, FRG was able to win over security voters, swing voters, and victim voters. A majority viewed the FRG as best able to implement the peace and to fight crime. 85% of security voters chose the FRG. It won over swing voters, majority of swing voters, and it even won 47% of victims, a percentage higher than those voting for the nonviolent PAN party. Tellingly, 84% of security victim voters supported the FRG. And in electing this bloodstained party, voters did gain peace in Guatemala, but they lost liberalism, justice, and welfare. The war winner FRG proved best able to not only tie its own violent hands, but also to deter the rebels from remilitarizing. Given that no one anticipated that the balance of power between the rebels and the government would shift, any future war would yield the same war outcome, and so there was no reason to restart a war. Peace thus held. But at the same time, FRG locked in blanket amnesties for its rights abuses that took decades to overturn in the genocide trial and eroded Guatemala's nascent democracy, as we're seeing in the current elections. So I'll tell you a little bit about some avenues of thought that I think the book motivates. The book is about the immediate aftermath of war, but has implications for long-term political trajectories. I think that these merit more attention, particularly the evolution of bloodstained parties and their security brand over time. We see that many parties born of war all over Latin America, in the United States, in Africa, and Southeast Asia, in Asia. There are many parties that are born from war that last a long time and become strong parties, but some disappear after one or two election cycles. So understanding why would be important. Also, you see parties drawing on these security brands over time. You see Fujimori's daughter running in Peru. You see Rios Montt's daughter was running in this recent Guatemalan election, trying to revitalize their security brand. In the Philippines, Marcos is sort of bringing up the legacies of the dictatorship. Buhari in Nigeria brings up the draconian war against the terrorists in the 1980s to win elections years later. And so this type of security brand can endure, and when and why it gets reactivated successfully is a concern that I think is important. The book suggests that war-ravaged citizens opt for peace over justice. I'm looking in a study experimentally on how different types of transitional justice, such as perpetrator apologies or punishment, influences victims' emotions. We randomize videos of real transitional justice proceedings and share them with victims and measure their emotions afterwards. But understanding the processes of transitional justice and when it becomes possible over time is important in a context in which justice becomes dampened. And then the logic of the book may apply to other contexts of other types of security contexts, such as organized crime. And we see that parties run and voters elect in similar fashions when facing environments of high crime, even in local areas in the United States to across the Latin American region. And this also merits study. And the effect of electing these type of strongmen on democracy. And finally, the book is really about public opinion toward the use of force domestically within borders. But increasingly, civil wars are spilling over and are becoming internationalized. And so the question is, about the use of international force after internationalized civil wars, such as those in Iraq and Syria and Ukraine, and how people make sense of that violence and how they elect in these wars' hopeful aftermath. I want to just conclude very quickly to think about if the book has implications for American politics. And this book is not about American politics, but I was writing it in an interesting moment in American politics. And there's no doubt that violence is corroding American democracy and that support for violence in politics has become elevated in America. A survey last year found that over 20% of Americans were willing to condone political violence, and more than 40% of those polled believed that it was more important to have a strong leader for America than to have a democracy. And evidence suggests that actual violence and threats thereof have increased. Threats against politicians are on the rise. Armed demonstrations have become more prevalent. Militias' ranks have swelled, and the phenomenon of politicians supporting or not eschewing violence. And I think the book may shed some light on these trends, why politicians are willing to be linked to violence or at least not reject violence. I have a close colleague who has written a book about how the US is on the brink of civil war. And I certainly see some worrying trends, but I tend to disagree. We know that countries in the middle zone between democracy and authoritarianism are at the highest risk of civil war, and the US is fast engaging in democratic backsliding. We know that status reversal of a dominant ethnic group leads to the emotion of resentment and an impetus for political violence, a trend reflected in the demographic shifts in our nation. But we also know that the strongest predictor of civil war is being a poor country. And so the US's economic wealth should shield it from mass political violence. My book nonetheless helps lay bare the logic of violence in politics, maybe even US politics. But it highlights ways to combat this corrosive force. One, violent politicians perform well when security issues and crime are dominant issues. So reorienting elections away from these issues tends to bolster nonviolent parties. Two, and relatedly, making voters feel safe and countering fear-mongering politics and rhetoric reduces the importance of security issues. Citizens who perceive themselves safe are more likely to prioritize civil liberties and the rule of law and favor nonviolent parties. And three, countering misinformation is critical. Truth helps nonviolent parties. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments. You in the back.
Thank you very much. My actual question was, why are these war winners actually holding elections post-war as opposed to what is their position on Trumping?
Yes, that's a very good question. So democracy after war has become an incredibly robust sort of norm of the UN system. So anywhere where the UN is involved and international community is involved, they tend to hold elections. Also, because they perceive there is this potential that they're perceiving that they might perform well in the elections and then therefore are willing to hold them. But they're held across all cases, and parties try their hands at the polls, even if they only emerge with 1% of the vote. And so it doesn't seem like there's a huge selection. Very few parties are banned, not that many boycott. And so it is this sort of interesting, why are democratic elections held, particularly if the parties sometimes emerging from these conflicts don't end up doing as well as they would like, or end up doing poorly. But it is this incredibly robust empirical finding that across the world, these elections are held. And something that I'm thinking about looking more into it, especially in the role of the UN and peacekeepers on the holding of democratic elections. Yes, Mr. Blair.
Does your data support anything that relates to emotional intelligence of the voter? There are factors at all It just seems to be a topic people go,
Yeah.
that and artificial intelligence.
Well, there's definitely an emotional story here. It's not the case that these voters are hoodwinked or don't understand what's happening. There are the people who are not paying any attention to politics, who might be voting this way because of lack of information. And I think there's a bigger sort of reverse motivation population for whom this fig leaf might work because they want to vote for this party for security reasons. And so they sort of need this for social desirability purposes. They need them to be pretending that they're doing good things in order to justify it. And then for the victims, for that population, the fear of re-victimization is especially important. So not everyone will be convinced by these acts that they'll restrain in the future, but some will. And in some cases, these are real costly signals of the intent to restrain themselves. And so, for example, in El Salvador, the president at the time ended up dismissing 100 of the military officers and really purging them. And so that is a costly signal that they will restrain in the future.
Thanks, that was really fascinating and beautifully delivered. One reflection and one question. I'm just thinking how it has parallels in functioning democracies, that the more insecure the population, the more likely they are to vote for a right-wing government. And then I'm also wondering if we can predict, thanks to your research, that in a post-Civil War situation, the aggressor is likely to become the government. Are there interventions that can be made? Are there strategies that can be provided to the non-violent party to be more effective in those situations?
These are all such great questions. So in terms of I'll take your second question first about intervention. So some of what I was pointing to in American politics, I think applies across the board, how we can bolster what I call non-belligerent or non-violent parties, which is to, obviously everyone wants to make people feel safe after civil war and make peace and prevent crime, which often skyrockets after conflict. And so that's an objective in and of itself, but it's also an objective insofar as it might help bolster non-violent parties. And trying to level the playing field, the media playing field, and the context I study are almost all older media contexts where you see a lot of manipulation of public opinion through print media and radio media, TV media. And there's a potential in the newer world of social media that the playing field could be more leveled, even if there are more opportunities for misinformation. But in any way, countering all of the misinformation, because a lot of this is spin, manipulation of people's perceptions of what happened during the war. And so I think that can help nonviolent parties. And also, I sort of touched on these sort of optimal strategies for the parties. And to the extent that parties diverge from those strategies, they tend to perform worse. And so so if they adopt this sort of tactic, rule abider strategy, they will perform better. So helping them make sure they run clean civilians with good rule of law credentials, making sure they are using a moderate platform. All of these types of things can also help the non-belligerent parties. In terms of how it applies to more developed contexts, that was your first question.
Yes, I'm just saying
yeah.
that I can see how it translates.
Yeah, so there's, but not in the US, the right tends to own the security issue. That's not necessarily true in other contexts of the world. And indeed, one of the reasons why I include the Nicaragua case is that the left actually, because it won the war, was able to use the same type of strategy to win the elections. But in the US context, it is the right. But the same sort of demand for iron fist security policies and parties providing those types of security policies applies across all contexts, even in, I think, in the midterms in US cities, you saw some of that. In my current project, I'm looking at war between criminal groups, between cartels and between gangs, and between those criminal groups and the state. And one of the pathways by which you get war between cartels in the state or gangs in the state is through the same kind of pathway where people demand militarized policing, and the parties run and offer to supply the militarization of law enforcement and deploying troops in order to fight organized crime.
We sort of touched on, we know how social media influence elections and development, or develop democracies. But we still have to say about its role in these developing democracies and what we see.
Yeah, so I haven't really studied environments. I mean, I guess the closest is the 2018 election in Colombia, where there was a lot of misinformation, and I looked a little bit at the Bolsonaro process of through WhatsApp and through social media of spreading disinformation. But I'm not an expert on this. Most of the conflicts that I know best that I've studied for years are sort of old. And anyone who knows me knows I'm a dinosaur, and I'm like, it's amazing I got this to run. But that's it. I think that there are interesting, all sorts of interesting ways in which social media is changing a lot about what we know about mobilization and violence, from the ability of people to coordinate and know if their friends are going to show up, and it sort of leads to all sorts of mobilization and protests that were never possible before. So you see sort of ability to overcome collective action problems in ways that are very interesting, and to all sorts of ability to spread your narrative. And it's not necessarily the parties that have control over the state media anymore that are at an advantage because of the role of WhatsApp. And maybe the Salvadoran Countess Bukele ran his whole campaign on WhatsApp. And so you can do, or on one of the social media platforms. And so the fact that you can be an outsider party and then defies a lot of what we know about politics. So I think we're only beginning to learn about how it influences the dynamics that I look at in this project. And someone should definitely write that. Yes.
Yeah, I live in Miami, and we have a large segment of the population comes from Latin America and South America, and the reason why they come is to flee the violence and the upheaval in those countries. So they come to Florida, and they tend to vote for the same type of politicians as those that they left. And I always thought, have you figured out why did you leave? Well, there seems to be a tendency, and maybe it is because they feel secure in the United States. I don't know. But it is an observation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation. And the Hispanic vote the variation in the Hispanic vote and the Hispanic and Latino vote, and the vote especially in across from the Southwest or the South to Florida, the fact that it varies, and the fact that you do sometimes see these what you wouldn't counterintuitive voting, sometimes voting against their pocketbook interests, sometimes voting against what you would expect in terms of their immigration policies. And I think this project in general speaks to why you see voters voting in counterintuitive ways in all sorts of environments, from what's wrong with Kansas and why people are voting for the right who are voting for non-redistributive parties when they need redistribution, to parties in India who are voting for ethnic Hindu nationalist parties that are harming them socially and economically, and so it is, are people voting for parties that are tied to corruption or to criminal groups across the board. So I think that this is a broader question that at times you have to study what actually is driving their voting, and it might not be the factor that you assume they're voting on, such as material interests or ethnic identities or otherwise. And I think in this context, something else is driving the voting and not just their immigrant backgrounds.
Sarah, can you tell us an anecdote from any of your field work that was particularly a lightning bolt of an aha moment for you, or a sort of a microcosm of a bunch of issues? Like this data is so interesting. There's so much math in your research, and then I'm also so struck with field work and all these millions of conversations. Is there one that really stood out to you?
I guess, I mean, I think the aha moment came when I was conducting work in Antioquia and Urabá in Colombia. And these are areas that had been sort of hegemonically controlled by the paramilitaries. And what really happened there is that there was so much violence between the FARC guerrillas, the rebels, the military, the paramilitaries, and in places where the paramilitaries, such as this one part in Apartado in Urabá in Colombia, where they established control, and they established control through cleansing and through horrific. I mean, they were some of the most brutal armed groups on earth, the Colombian paramilitaries, but they established peace. And then it was interviews with people who would say, now I can go and join my dance group. I can open a bakery again. I'm able to cross a border, a neighborhood border that I haven't been able to cross to see my family that lives on the other side of this border that was demarcated between different guerrilla groups and the paramilitaries. My kids can go to school. I can have a party. And so even if it came through the most brutal types of methods, it was that relief and I think it's very hard to appreciate if you haven't lived in a very unsafe environment, how much security is this psychological, going back to Mr. Moriarty's great question, this sort of psychological relief is the corollary. And so even if violence leads to it leads to anger because you think this actor has committed violence against me, which leads to the emotion of anger and the desire for retribution. That's sort of the emotional cognitive process. And so you should want to punish them at the polls. There's the addition, they led to violence, but then they brought peace. And that peace is bringing this relief. And so they did this bad action, but also this good action. And that is this sort of offsetting mechanism that I experienced in these communities in which I lived. And this relief led them to be willing to support these brutal groups because they wanted that peace to endure. And that doesn't last forever. And that's the kind of glimmers of hope in the book, is that there are all sorts of ways in which the power could be eroded over time and opportunities for justice can emerge. But that was sort of my aha moment in understanding what might be happening and sort of motivated me to write the book. Well, I think a lot is summarized out in
all that.
How did you feel safe? As you wander through these areas of atrocities.
So when I was doing my fieldwork, I often wore sort of different hats that gave me different perspectives and angles on the question I was trying to get at. And so I worked with the Organization of American States Peace Mission, and they wore their vest, and it had a big no gun, we're unarmed, essentially peacekeepers, and we went in huge vans that had no gun, and that was helpful. Sometimes I went as an academic, and in general in Colombia, armed groups, criminal groups will do whatever they want, but the armed groups didn't want to. At the period when I was there, were not necessarily targeting Americans, didn't want to get into the whole international problems that would involve. So as an American academic, I could be safe entering certain places. When I went into reintegration programs, I was working with the government. I worked with the reintegration of former combatants program for a few months, and that also gave me access. obviously elite interviews are far easier, but I went into the prisons in Colombia and interviewed mid-ranking and top ranking. So I was usually interviewing people who were in prison or disarmed, or hopefully disarmed, but so I tried that was an approach. And another challenge is interviewing victims and making sure that I'm really telling their story, because they were incredibly generous in speaking to me. And so I'm hopeful that, going back to this question, that there might be potential interventions that would lead to better outcomes in these situations.
I have a question. How can we buy your book?
Well, it's summer in August. I brought you into a very dark place. So my book, I think, we have a box of books, I think, that's somewhere, maybe out there, and I'm happy to sign the book. That's something my family will buy. Like 2 more copies of it. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope that you have a wonderful August evening in Maine.
Good night.